I gave my first talk publicly just after I finished a PhD. And that's when I, for the very first time, said we should change the name English as a foreign language to English as a lingua franca. And I just put up on the used overhead transparencies then. I put, not PowerPoint, and I put up ESL and then an arrow, ELS, and said, guess what the ELF is? And it took a lot of time before anybody came up with English as a lingua franca. But then most people, there were a few people that thought this was a great idea. Most people didn't. I think Robin was amongst those that didn't, but then did. And when my 2000 book came out, I heard that there was this head of this big language school in Slovenia. I don't know the name of the school, but somebody from Slovenia told me at a conference that this woman had been walking around, it's this book, walked around holding up this book around the school and telling people, do not read this book, telling the teachers they were not to read it.
Really?
I mean, I don't know.
In
Slovenia, talk about gatekeeping, right?
Yeah.
Wow, yeah.
It's like when they burn books behind schools, right?
Censorship.
Wow.
My goodness.
I don't think that was exaggeration. She was exaggerating to me, but she did say, I was told this. And there were an awful lot of people. It's interesting because there were people that had like public arguments with me in other prints, like in an ELT, J Point and Counterpoint. I won't name her. She's changed her mind now, but only recently. But there was a point and counterpoint where I wrote the point on testing. And one of the things I've been really pushing for is we need to change English language testing and to stop testing it against native English, especially when it's for entry into university. But not only, but especially. And I wrote this point, and this other person who did work for whatever Cambridge, it was called UCCLS at the time, University of Cambridge Local Examination Syndicate. It's been through many like name changes since then, but this was in the early 2000s. And she wrote a scathing riposte in her counterpoint. And then I wrote and picked holes in all her points in my short response. But I gather she's now very into the idea of the multilingualism thrown in. But it's interesting how many people, to use a phrase, an idiom, I'm really against the use of local idioms. I guess you guys all know, but I'm not sure everybody listening to the podcast will know the idiom jump on the bandwagon. It's basically when something becomes very fashionable and then people who didn't much like it suddenly decide, oh, I do like it and I'm going to do it because it's going to get me noticed because it's a big topic. And that happens so much. After it gradually, as it started to get accepted, so many people stopped being rude about it, basically, because a lot of people were very rude. I mean, at the very beginning, it's more political now than it was, but right from the very beginning, the work I did, it was highly political. It was very radical. It was all about power from the start and all about the power of the native English speaker and trying to fight that, resist that. And that's why the ELT establishment really didn't like it. They really didn't like it. Even as recently as 2015, when I gave a talk to the testing conference in Taiwan, and there were two people from whatever Cambridge now calls itself, two very senior people. I won't name them again, different from the one who did the point and counterpoint. And they sat there listening they were hoping that they would be able to pick holes in, find faults with what I said. I did a big plenary at this conference. They couldn't find anything I said that they could say is wrong, but they didn't like it. They really didn't like this idea that we shouldn't be testing against native English. Native English is not relevant to the vast majority of English users in the world. And why do we test them against it? Ridiculous.
Yeah. It's interesting what you're saying because it sounds like ELT in general, and we've had a conversation with Robin and Gemma. We've had a conversation with Bill Van Patten, who is also a linguist and a researcher. And it seems like for some reason in English language teaching in this field of ours, a field of education where we're constantly trying to come up with new ideas to try to change things, there's very little rethinking being done. And I think you've done a great job in terms of pioneering a concept that I think is pushing language teaching, language education in a different direction. But before we jump into ELF or talking about the native speaker versus the local speaker, I wanted to go back a little bit to the beginning of your life, of your humble beginnings in applied linguistics. You were telling me that you were at age 22, you were moving from London to Southampton. And
No, that was when I was doing research in Oxford. I actually started, I felt it, this is probably strike you as strange now, but my first research, it was for an Oxford DPhil, but I gave it up. It was in Icelandic.
yes, old Icelandic, yes.
Old
So
Icelandic, same as modern Icelandic, so you just call it Icelandic.
why that? What initially drew you to linguistics? Interest in this idea of working with old Icelandic evolve into a focus on English as a lingua franca. I don't see the connection.
Really, and it was when I did my first degree, my BA degree in English language and literature, I loved all the language related topics. We did linguistics, we did a lot of pure linguistics, but we did Old English and what they called Old Norse, which is Old Icelandic, and various other things. And I just really, actually, it was the Old English that I liked most. And I went to do that and then switched to Old Icelandic, partly because when I got to Oxford, I discovered that there was so little written in Old English that I'd already read it all. So I switched to Old Icelandic because there's a massive number of sagas and lots of them haven't been edited. So I thought I'd like to edit one of these for my PhD. I gave that up because I just ran out of interest in it after a while. And I got married and had the first child very quickly. After I'd had children, I thought I need to earn some money. So I became an EFL teacher and very quickly did all the ELT exams because it was boring just teaching. I did the exams. And then my interest was in linguistics, not in just the EFL. And it was because of the EFL that I realized how much I didn't like EFL. I liked the teaching. I really loved the teaching. In fact, I never laughed so much as those years when I was teaching EFL. I had such a good time with the students. But I was in rooms with about 16 students who came from all around the world. Furthest afield would have been places like Mexico, a lot of Europeans and a lot of Japanese, and big from all over. And that was when I started to notice how they talk to each other. How I basically for myself discovered DELF. And that's why I decided after I'd finished with the ELT exams and done what I could, there was no more to do. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do a PhD. And I went off to do a PhD in London University and put forward this proposal and the PhD ended up being about accommodation, about how they accommodated to each other. Because what I found was that they understood each other and they very quickly sorted it out if they didn't. And the reason I first worked on pronunciation was because most of the problems were pronunciation related. So that's how it happened, basically. And I collected data from them and other places. I taught in quite a few places and not EFL, I did the P as well. Collected all the data and did the PhD. And then I carried on collecting data and wrote the book, which was basically the PhD. But it was about accommodation. It was how they adjusted their language to make it more intelligible to each other. So sometimes they adjusted it anyway, and sometimes they saw there was a problem, and then they set it again and adjusted it. And they also got very used to each other. They used to joke about each other's pronunciation. They used to mimic it and have a laugh about it in class even.
I think my question, because I remember you wrote a paper about accommodation. I think the title was Accommodation in ELF, where you basically talk about the concept of accommodation. And as you said, a lot of the times when people are using English, specifically in multilingual contexts, there is almost like an invisible written rule or an invisible rule where speakers have to somewhat accommodate. And they do this, as you said, by adjusting their pronunciation, they adjust their vocabulary, and even, as you've mentioned in the paper, nonverbal communication, and all of this to promote this mutual intelligibility. My question then becomes, because you've highlighted how accommodation serves not only as a communicative, but also in terms of social purposes. and the example you've mentioned was maintaining group identity. Perhaps you could talk more about that, and also maybe elaborate on how teachers can raise awareness of these social dynamics in ELF classrooms as well.
The question of if teachers need to earn more money to stay in ELT is really the wrong question these days. That one's largely been answered with precarity, 0-hour contracts, inconsistent work. The question isn't, do I need to earn more? The question really is, how do I make it work? Our TAP program, or Teacher Accelerator program, works with teachers like you directly to help make it happen. Through the process of being in the program, we help teachers build a lean, profitable, and pedagogically sound teaching business. 3 pillars that are really important to us. We started Learn Your English based on pedagogy, responsive pedagogy, evidence-supported teaching through research. One of the reasons we started this podcast as well. And we apply that now working with teachers to build courses, offers, and support for their clients in the same manner. The TAP program really is your roadmap to monetize your skills by, number 1, creating an irresistible offer, number 2, selling it effectively, and number 3, securing consistent clients, 3 pillars of any successful business. And while no one in ELT is building multi-million-dollar businesses in this fashion, it's a way for you and for all of us to first stay in the industry, to work with people that we love to help, to get paid for our work. And our goal for anyone who joins us in the program is within a 6 to 12 month period, you can make an informed choice, meaning you've built your business up to a certain point where you can use information to decide if keeping your school job and your business or just doing the business on its own is the right choice for you. If you want more information on if the program is a good fit for you or how we would work together, there's a link below. You can book a free chat with us so we can go through all of the details. There's lots of resources on our landing page, our website, and on this YouTube channel as well, and lots of interviews with clients that we've worked with where you can hear their stories, what it was like, and see if that resonates with you. If you're looking to earn a little bit more and really establish yourself in your niche, in your field this year, we'd love to chat. And now, let's get back to the show.
Hej, jag heter Rebecca och jag kommer ifrån Sverige och du lyssnar på Teacher Talking Time, the Learn Your English podcast. Hi, my name is Rebecca and I'm from Sweden and you're listening to the Teacher Talking Time, the Learn Your English podcast.
Oh goodness, it's a very long time since I wrote anything about teaching, and I've been about English teaching. I haven't done it myself for a very long time. I did, in the very first book, I did have 1 or 2 chapters on how people could do it, but I don't even work on pronunciation issues. I haven't done for a long time because people always assumed, because I started on phonology, that my main interest was in phonology, but it wasn't. My main interest was in ELF.
Mm-hmm.
But I started on phonology because it was very clearly the thing that was most salient and most noticeable to. It was the thing that caused the problems. It was the thing they adjusted. They didn't really adjust anything else that I noticed. They certainly didn't adjust their grammar, but it was always the pronunciation or nearly always the pronunciation. I'm trying to remember what I actually said in that book that was written between 1997 and 19.
It's hard to
Forgive
remember.
him.
Yeah, no worries on that.
I didn't say much more, really. Soon after that, I was working on the attitudes and why people had the attitudes they had towards ELF. And I'm working on the response I'd had, basically, and how invested people were in their English and that sort of thing. But I think what I was talking about was where you have, and you increasingly have now, all around the world, classes, probably English language teaching classes, where you have people from lots of different places, and you have the raw material in your classes. All you do is focus on your students and get people to say, look, compare how you say something with how X, Y, and Z says it. And they immediately, because it's much more about, it's about familiarizing people so that not only are they able to understand when somebody says something different way, in a different way from how they say it, but also adjusting their own if they think somebody won't understand it. I mean, I had really good examples of this when I deliberately, at one point, when I was collecting the data, took exam preparation classes and did a lot of speaking practice with them, preparing them in pairs for the paired exam. an exam. It was a CAE exam. It only just come out. And it was the first time we'd run it, and they did it in pairs. And so I did lots of practices with them, and I recorded the practices. And I told them I was recording it so that we could listen afterwards and help them understand what had happened. But obviously it was for my data as well. And at the end, I did ask them, could I use this data? I explained to them, they were interested. I said to them, this group, I collected all this data from you. Is it okay? Oh, you do what you like. We don't care. But I found things like the Japanese, and I had in two of the pairs were Japanese and Swiss German. And they had awful struggles understanding each other. And two interesting things was, one, that 4 weeks apart, the Japanese had said, I forgot what, to put it simply, she'd mixed up the R and the L. So she said glay instead of grey. And the German had heard the G sound as a K because they devoice the initial consonant. That's why they all call me Chili. But not all of them. I don't want to offend anybody. But 4 weeks later, she did it again. And he immediately understood this time. And when we went through the post-discussion, and I recorded the post-discussion as well, and he said something like, I know she always gets her R's and L's wrong. This is the Swiss Germans.
Yeah.
But I knew this time what she meant. He learned to be familiar with this, but it was 4 weeks earlier he hadn't. And the other thing, I must say this because I was really annoyed about this. I collected this particular set of data from several weeks of these speaking practice meetings. And then I came up with, from that, I came up with these 40 examples of miscommunication. I thought in all these hours, I'd only found these 40 examples, and 27 of them, I think it was 27, were pronunciation. And people then accused me of using only this for the Lingua Franca core, and people who didn't like the Lingua Franca core attacked it because all I had was 27 examples. It wasn't. It was 5 years PhD research, all the accommodation research, and then a few more years of data collection. It was masses and masses, a pile this high of data, all on paper. And it was masses. I'd read all the stuff I'd recorded and transcribed, and it was not just 40 examples. But yeah, that was what was happening. Going back to what teachers can do, and if they don't have people from different places, there's always technology. Just play things to students, speakers of other languages, and compare, and just raise awareness of what's different, and instead of eternally playing native English and saying this is what you have to do, play other speakers from other languages to compare with how they do it, and let them notice. And that's what I would do in that position.
Sounds like that's what you did, Jenny, if I'm understanding correctly. Did your, I guess, passion for pronunciation, do you think you had a predisposition for it, or did just going through the teaching and noticing what you're describing, you noticed that led to a vision, or, oh, this is interesting?
I think people have always assumed, because my book was on phonology, that my big interest was in pronunciation. I always enjoyed phonology. I did it at undergraduate level. I did it at master's level. And then it was what I focused on for my PhD. But it wasn't a really strong interest. And for years afterwards, I was getting asked to write books on pronunciation or write articles. And I don't want to. I wanted to move on. I'm interested in ELT. I guess I'm more interested in accent and accent attitudes than in pronunciation on its own. And I was teaching, we set up a BA at King's around the time that first book was published, and I was asked to do the pronunciation in the language description set. I was asked to do the pronunciation and more phonology and phonetics, I think they probably called it. And I said I would do it as long as I could call it phonology, phonetics and accent. And I did a lot of stuff on accent attitudes, and the students were much more interested in that than in just the phonetic alphabet. And
I
Um,
can imagine.
it's much more interesting why people have attitudes and
Right.
how the attitudes relate to the speaker, who causes those attitudes. I'm just very interested in all that.
We had someone on the show too, Dr. Jane Setta. I think you probably know her.
She's seen very well, yeah.
Yes, she was on the show and she talked a lot about that as well. But I wanted to go back to ELF now. And I know that probably your definition of ELF has changed ever since you started researching this and writing about this. How would you define English as a lingua franca in 2024, 2025, or 21st century, if you prefer? And I would like you to perhaps tell us more about why it's so important to distinguish ELF from these traditional English models.
Okay, how I define it. I did produce a definition of English as a multilingua franca, but I can't remember exactly the wording of it. But it was basically about English where used by multilingual speak, but the English may or not be may be chosen, it may not be chosen. I can't really remember. I could look it up. I'm sure it's in this 4th edition of Global Englishes, but I've moved on anyway from that to multilingualism with English, which is basically multilingualism where English is one of the languages that the speakers in the communication have. It may be used, it may not be used, but it's used in their way. I don't know that I could say more than that. Yeah.
What I found here, one of your papers, where you basically called it repositioning English and multilingualism in English as a lingua franca.
That one where I talked about English as a multilingua franca for the first time.
That was the first one, right?
Yeah. Definition in that paper is the one that I used until we started talking about, there's a little group of us set up this Centre for Multilingualism with English. But 3 years ago, we launched it last year because we had to wait for COVID.
You describe it in phases. You have ELF phase 1, ELF
1, 2, 3,
phase
4.
2. Yeah. Perhaps you can just give us a brief overview of these phases, just so people understand that a little bit more.
So when I first started, when I had first identified what I thought was this English as a lingua franca, I didn't call it that immediately. I called it International English at the beginning because I didn't think of the name English as a lingua franca till 1996, just after I finished the PhD. But when I started to look to see if there was any literature on this, there was none. Well, the literature in the ELT field was second language acquisition stuff, and it was all about acquiring native English. And then there was World Englishes, which I didn't know about when I first started. I started the PhD in 1989, and that's when I started looking for literature, and I found World Englishes, and I thought, oh, this is really interesting. And people like Braj Katru and Larry Smith, unfortunately dead now, and I loved reading their stuff. And I was deeply influenced by this. I was influenced really by their ideology that English is not the preserve of the native English speakers. There are a lot of other people who have it, maybe more than the natives, and they're entitled to use it their way. Anyway, I guess I was very influenced by this. So I assumed that we were talking about varieties of English because World English is very much about varieties. You have Indian and Singapore and Nigerian and Ghanaian, whatever. You have a whole range of varieties of English that have their characteristics. And that really influenced me. So when I first wrote about ELF, I was thinking in terms of there would be varieties. There might be German ELF and Japanese ELF and so on. And at that time, I was researching alone. I was the only empirical researcher. But after a few people got interested and decided they would do research in their own context, and then Anna Maurinen collected her corpus, Alpha English as a Lingua Franca in Academic Settings. She was in Finland. Barbara Seidelhofer in Austria, the Voice Corpus, Vienna, Oxford, International Corpus of English, and then much later Andy Kirkpatrick, the International Corpus of English, Oh no, the Asian Corpus of English, ACE. But the data that they collected, once they collected loads, showed you couldn't possibly talk about varieties because nothing was set. There was no way of saying this is how they're going to do it. It was different. Not every time, but it was different. It depended who was speaking with who, what the setting was, what the topic was. It really varied a lot. And so the second phase was to say that ELF is variable, and variability is probably its defining characteristic. So we separated from World Englishes. At that stage, it wasn't just me anymore. It was me and some other researchers separated from World Englishes, saying the ideology is very much the same. We are still looking at English is not a native. It can be the native language for native English speakers when they're talking with each other. They don't have to be in England or in the UK or wherever. They can be in other countries as well, and they needn't even be English-speaking countries. But it's English speakers with native speakers, English speakers. But as far as anybody else is concerned, we can't talk about. I would dispute that there's anything called a native English variety anyway. I think it's very diverse, and I think it's about time everybody recognised that. But couldn't possibly talk about varieties. You could only talk about the variability of it. And then a whole load of new people started to join in. We had the very first ELF conference in Helsinki in 2008. Only about 80 people came. But then the word spread, and it was after that we got lots of people started to talk about how to teach it and what could you do to teach it. And then we have a whole spate of people talking about ELF-aware teaching, ELF-informed teaching. I don't know that it was terribly clear to teachers what was meant by that. I'm not sure. I think it's probably improved now. But the focus was still very much on the Englishness. And by then, I had started to think we shouldn't be focusing on the Englishness of it. It really is. The more I travelled and the more I spoke with people, the more I thought, I hardly ever speak with a native speaker of English. This is not an English phenomenon. This is a multilingual phenomenon. And I was with people who would move in and out of other languages. And I realised we needed to reconceptualize it, which is why wrote that paper, about English as a Lingua Franca. So that was the third phase. The fourth phase is very new, and I'm not sure that it will lead to anybody changing the name, and I'm not bothered about labels. My only interest in labels is that I do feel that if you have a name, if you give something a name, it draws attention to it, and it makes that. So when it was English as a Multilingua Franca, it really did draw attention to the multilingualism. In fact, when I first gave a paper on that, on a spoken paper on that written one, it was in York, at York St. John, and it was a very small seminar group. And there was a debate afterwards with about 30 of us, and there was a debate about whether the name needed changing. And I said I wasn't at all bothered about whether people changed the name, but there was one person who actually didn't know much about ELF at all, because this wasn't a conference on ELF. And she said, but the thing about the name is once you give something a label, that really does draw attention to it. It really does make people think about it, whereas otherwise people have to read the paper before, and they might not do that. But if the name is there in other people's writing, they might start to think more about it. And certainly a lot of younger people are using that, including in Japan. I know of several in Japan who are using it.